Okay, let's start now. Welcome all to day 3 of Rethinking Economics India Network's annual event, Dialogues on Economic Realities. I'm Shraddha Jain. I'm pursuing my PhD from Center for Development Studies, and I will be moderating today's session. So today's theme has been Better Economics for Climate Change and Biodiversity. And in this session, we would be talking about better economics for climate change and worker well-being. The session has been organized by Rethinking Economics India Network in collaboration with the Good Business Lab. I'm glad to have our partners here. Rethinking Economics India Network is a national network of the global rethinking economics movement working on building new, alternate, and pluralistic economic thinking in India. Our partners, Good Business Lab, is a labor innovation firm which aims to increase investment in worker well-being, and they do this by conducting rigorous research which shows that investing in workers can have a positive impact on business bottom lines. We have been joined by 3 speakers today, and we'll be starting with Achyuta Adhvaryu, who is a co-founder and Chief Development Officer at Good Business Lab. He is also an associate professor of business economics and public policy at University of Michigan. He pursues a research agenda at the intersection of business economics, development, and health. Current work is focused on understanding determinants of workers' productivity, measuring the impact of interventions that increase productivity while improving key aspects of worker well-being. He holds a PhD in economics from Yale University. Next, we have Sai Siddhat, who is Senior Policy Associate at JPAL South Asia, where he leads the energy, environment, and climate change sector. He previously led finance sector and worked on the cash transfers for Child Health Initiative at JPAL South Asia. Prior to joining JPAL, he worked at National Health Authority in India, where he helped set up their innovation unit, and then Government of Maharashtra on a water conservation program, and then New York City government program on their green infrastructure program. He holds a master's degree in public administration from Columbia University. Our third speaker of the day is Starlene, who is a co-founder and managing partner at Green Earth. And Green Earth is a climate venture fund and innovation firm established to make low carbon economy possible. They work with startups, think tanks, incubators, leading corporates, philanthropists, and investors to align available resources, provide customized support, and strengthen the viability of the sector. They aim towards keeping the planet below 2-degree temperature increase and provision of clean resources for all. Welcome, everybody. Through this session, we want to know what impact climate change has on our everyday lives and livelihoods, and what can be done about the same. We aim to understand the effects on the most vulnerable and question the transition to the circular economy with respect to how truly inclusive they are. We also want to shed light to the importance of including the most vulnerable as equal stakeholders while designing climate solutions. So today's session is designed in 2 rounds and then the closing remarks. And we as a group have prepared few questions for our panelists. We'll be putting them for deeper conversations. And I request to limit the responses to 7 to 8 minutes so that we have enough time for discussion. Without much delay, I start our conversation with Achyuta Adhvaryu. And our first question to you is as follows. From GBL's perspective, how does climate change and worker well-being interact? What is the work that GBL has done on the interaction of worker well-being, private firms' interest, and climate change? Please share your comments on the same. Thank you.
Sure, and thank you for organizing this session, and very happy to be part of it. and very pleased to meet the other panelists and look forward to a good discussion. So I'll keep my response short, and I look forward to hearing everyone else's thoughts on this. Climate change is obviously sort of one of the small handful of driving issues of our time, of the future generations, and I think that as it applies to the economy, much has been said about how climate change is going to reduce agricultural output, how it's going to, have massive effects on the probabilities of extreme events, of coastal erosion, and cities along coastlines, etc. There's, I think, less has been done in terms of both research as well as advocacy work, and policy change around workers and climate change. I think that a large part of what we know in that space comes from agricultural workers who are largely, working outdoors, and of course will face huge impacts in terms of their livelihoods, but also in terms of their health and well-being and the well-being of their families, as their places where they live grow hotter and hotter, particularly in low-income countries in the world. I think, while we have started to devote a little bit of attention to the idea that workers of all kinds might be affected, and in particular low-income workers who are doing manufacturing and services work, evidence is starting to emerge now that even they will feel the effects of climate change in pretty big ways. So a lot of the work that we do at Good Business Lab, and that I do in my own research, centers around this basic idea that the well-being, kind of generally defined, of workers factors in a really big way into the profitability of firms. And so, the savvy firm who cares about bottom lines should be thinking about worker well-being not just as, something they do to satisfy their, buyers, or something they do, to keep consumers happy, or to keep auditors happy, etc. But it's something that, firms should invest in because they know that these are good investments for their bottom line. So, the health of workers is a prime example, right? If you have an unhealthy workforce, it's not rocket science to think that that your workers won't be productive, and when your workers aren't productive, that means that you'll also suffer in terms of your profits and future growth. And when we think about health, I think one of the primary determinants in low-income country context, and particularly in places like manufacturing firms, health is highly tied to your workplace environment. So if your workplace environment is highly polluted or is extremely hot, it stands to reason, and there's quite a lot of good laboratory evidence to suggest that productivity goes down by quite a bit. One of Good Business Lab's objectives is not only kind of to make this type of link salient in the minds of decision makers, so reminding firms that, hey, you probably know a bunch of ways in which your workers' well-being is tied to your own profitability and future growth. But it's also kind of putting numbers to that story, that if you invest in various ways in your workers, that investment can actually generate a return for you as the firm owner or firm leadership. And that's powerful because it helps us to spread, essentially, interventions that improve the well-being and lives of low-income people through the private sector. The public sector does quite a lot in this regard already, but where the public sector can't reach, the private sector can step in and have real impact. And so that's what we sort of aim to do. And in this space regarding climate change, the sort of major contribution that we've made in terms of that evidence generation is thinking about the effects of heat on factory floors and how that contributes to reductions in productivity. So I think there's a lot of kind of macro evidence to this regard. So, for example, if you look at the, say, country level, um, you can think about how annual temperatures in a country relate to output in that country with regard to various sectors like manufacturing, services, agriculture, etc. Um, but kind of zooming into the micro level and understanding how can pulling a certain lever to make workers' environments more comfortable actually generate changes in profitability. That is a sort of harder link to establish, and largely just because of data reasons. You need to match up really detailed data on temperatures with data on workers' actual productivities in any given context. And so, that's the sort of niche where I think Good Business Lab, as well as my own research, along with the work of my co-authors, comes in handy. So I'm going to just take a minute or so to describe a study that we did in garment factories in and around Bangalore in India. Um, and the kind of purpose of the study was essentially to illuminate this relationship between heat and productivity. And this is joint work with Anant, who's a faculty member at Michigan alongside me, and also a co-founder of Good Business Lab, and Namrata Kala, who is a faculty member at MIT's School of Business, the Sloan School of Business. Um, so in this study, we essentially investigate this relationship between heat and productivity using unique, really, really fine-grained data on the productivity of garment workers. And so, we've all kind of, have this image in mind of sort of hot and sweaty, garment factories. And I think that's, yeah, in most cases, a very accurate image, having walked around on many garment factory floors at this point. Um, it's extremely hot on inside a garment firm, and even when you have ventilation and that sort of thing, um, the outdoor temperature affects how hot it is inside. And so we simply, took data on workers and their productivity, and we related it to data on ambient heat at a very fine grain level. What we find is pretty stark, that essentially for very hot days, so essentially days that are kind of above about 27, 28 degrees Celsius, every additional degree Celsius increase in temperature decreases, the worker's productivity by about 2 efficiency points, or about 5%. Okay, so each additional degree Celsius that you increase the temperature above this sort of high heat threshold, you increase the temperature, the temperature in the factory floors, and that leads to a decrease in productivity. So um, you know, as you might imagine, that's pretty substantial when you're thinking about the sorts of data that's been coming in about heat over the last, say, decade. Because in the last decade, we've had something like, 6 or 7 of the hottest years ever on record. And that's definitely true in southern India. Where temperatures, are skyrocketing. So even a place like Bangalore, which is known for sort of quote unquote temperate, temperatures, you're seeing, regularly that there are many, many days above 30, 35 degrees Celsius. And so that actually means that workers on these days are going to be substantially more inefficient. And so what we do is just basically quantify the extent to which that impacts firm profits. And so, when you do that, you find that basically it is quite worth investing in cooling technologies and other ways to substantially reduce your factory's ambient temperatures on factory floors. Because if you do that, even though that's a substantial investment, you're gaining productivity on those particularly hot days. And so this just kind of goes, one example of the ways in which workers of all kinds are going to be affected by climate change, and also maybe the role that the private sector might play in mitigating some of that impact. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to future discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for highlighting the importance of generating evidence about how worker well-being is important for the firms themselves. Thank you. Moving on, so our question to Sai is that connected to the perspective offered by Achyuta, please tell us the work JPAL has done in the sector and how do you see this sector is evolving in the near future? Thank you.
Thank you, Shraddha. First up, apologies for the few minutes that I was delayed joining the webinar. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on here and be on the panel with Achyuta and Starlene. So just a little bit about JPAL. So JPAL is an organization set up with a mission to reduce poverty by informing policy decisions with scientific evidence. Now, scientific evidence we predominantly draw from the field of economics, political science, business, as well as public health, etc. Now, the research work that we do is led by a network of affiliated researchers. There are over 260 of them now. Arch is one among those researchers as well. And these are independent researchers who are based at universities across the world. Now, the research that they do is randomized evaluation specifically. There's a lot of very interesting methodologies that also just like fit in with this. But when we say scientific evidence, we are drawing this evidence from randomized evaluations. So that's just a bit about JPAL. Now, coming to the energy, environment, and climate change sector. So as Arch mentioned, as climate change progresses, the people who will be the worst affected by it are the already poor and vulnerable. It is the people on the factory floors, it is people who have to work outside who will be the most affected by it. So while there are very interesting technological and policy innovations out in the world, what policymakers lack really now is the real world impact of how these innovations are being implemented. So the idea of JPAL's work is to work with policymakers, technology innovators, CSOs, donors, etc., to collaborate with them and test out these interventions on the ground and generate evidence around it. So I want to illustrate this with one example of a research that was done in Gujarat several years ago. So many actors in the climate action space support energy efficiency programs as a way to reduce carbon emissions. So in Gujarat, there was one department that had energy audits as a program that was offered at a 50% subsidy to plants, very specifically SMEs that fall within a specific range of energy output. Now, researchers worked with the department to increase the subsidy from 50% to 100%, so it is essentially free, this audit system. So this audit system was offered to half of about 400 plants was the total sample, about 200 of them were offered this free audit system. And then on top of that, they also offered energy manager / energy consulting services to half of a random subset of the half. So from 250, about 100 plants were offered this. So the insights from this are coming out of one obvious in some instances, and in some cases counterintuitive. So the first thing that comes up is when these services are offered free, plants do take them up. So that's fairly intuitive for us to see that's the case. The second thing is that of the plants that actually were offered and took up these services, there's a likelihood that plants actually improve their productivity from energy as well as the efficiency of their machines. Now, the counterintuitive thing that's coming in is that in the short run, overall energy use comes down, but in the medium to long term, overall energy use starts going up. The reason behind this is that one, as plants started generating profits in the medium term, they reinvested these profits back into increasing, back into their plants to increase the overall capacity of these plants. The second thing they started doing is they started hiring better staff to start working on the implementation recommendations of the consultants, so that they are higher skilled labor pool working in the factory floors themselves. So given that most of India's energy supply, especially in the study region, like about 75% of it came from coal plants. So the marginal, additional marginal unit of energy effectively was drawn from coal. So while the consulting was useful, firm profits increased and they reinvested it back into their firms. The overall result was on net, it was a net social negative because of the increased emissions. So I think this just illustrates that I think we generally know which direction we have to go in, but not all solutions that we have in front of us may react in the way that we envision when we design them. And it's really important to test solutions on the ground before actually investing a lot more resources into them, because we are short on time. We don't have an unlimited amount of resources to resolve the problem in front of us. So I'm going to pause here and hand it back to you.
Thank you, Sai, for bringing us this so important example, which actually highlights the complex situation that we are in. We move forward to Starlene, and so drawing from Green Artha's focus on working with entire climate ecosystem and all stakeholders, could you please share your insights on how one could go about designing inclusive climate change solutions? Please share your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you, Shraddha, and thank you to the team that has put this together. It's really important to be, I'm glad to be here, but it's also really important to be hosting and discussing these topics, not just because they need to happen across diverse stakeholder groups, but in doing this, it's really enabling the alignment of different perspectives and the ability to create momentum around application and action of the work that's being done in the academic space, as well as the work that's being done in the business community. So when we think about how to design inclusive systems, it really starts with intent. And at Green Artha, we start off with the perspective that the realities of climate change are such that if we want to keep the planet livable, we have to have as many people as possible involved in the systems. And so, and also when we look at countries like India and countries that are developing rapidly, countries across Africa, countries across Southeast Asia, there's rapid development, and historically there's been this notion that development and climate are at odds with each other. But we really like to believe that they're not, and that there's actually huge economic opportunity in looking at how can we develop socially and economically while also being climate smart. And we think that India and other developing markets have phenomenal economic opportunity and GDP growth ahead of them if they do that well. But for them to do that well, it's important to look at businesses, it's important to look at policy, it's important to look at what corporates and industry are doing. But very much like with the Green Revolution, we also have to look at how can we democratize climate action, and look at how do we make it so that small businesses can participate? How do we balance the growth of small businesses like what Sai has been doing at JPAL with being more environmentally friendly in that? Are there additional layers perhaps that can be built into these energy efficiency systems that can actually take the fact that the companies are ready to be better and smarter and take that to the next level, right? And so, Achyuta was mentioning these ideas around implementing cooling technologies, and that is one opportunity that can be done to lower temperatures in factories. But there's also waste heat technology where you take the waste heat and actually turn it to energy. You lower the cost of energy required to operate a factory while at the same time improving working conditions. And that makes it so you could operate a cooling technology perhaps from the waste heat, as well as increase the cooling in a much more energy efficient, environmentally friendly way. So we like to look at systems like this. We believe that India and the developing economies have a phenomenal positioning to be able to take that up. And it's really about looking at how do we engage different stakeholders? How do we have an intent around that? How do we enable the businesses that are wanting to do that? How do we look at, and at Green Artha, we very much look at investing in innovation. And we believe that innovation is necessary across the board. There's innovation in policy that's needed, innovation in financing that's needed, innovation in technology, yes, as well as innovation in business model. And we fundamentally believe that innovation in business model is really key. There's certain people that say the technologies that we need today to reach net zero exist, but there's not the innovation that enables the diffusion of those business models or the diffusion of those technologies. And we do largely agree with this. We believe there are some technologies in battery storage and direct air capture that do need to be still invented for net zero. But we also see that there's a phenomenal need for the development of technologies around adaptation. And we're already seeing climate events happening. And we do see that the low-income populations are the worst hit by this. So how can we create economic systems in which they can participate, in which they can reap the benefits of participation, in which perhaps, very much like the Green Revolution, they can receive an economic benefit for doing what is better for the economy. And one of the things that we see there is that there may be a need for a fundamental shift to looking at how, instead of urbanization, how do we create more diffuse or distributed economies? So with that, I'll hand back to you for now, Shraddha, and look forward to the rest of the conversation. And I'm really excited to hear more from my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much to highlight the importance of diffusion, and especially the small businesses, which are the key for many economies at today's time. So great. So that gives me an opportunity to go to the second round of our conversation. So I hope to have more discussions on each other's perspective as well. So my first question to Achyuta again is that now that we have the discussions and about the approach from JPAL and Green Earth, how would you suggest profit-making businesses could be incentivized to improve work conditions and make them more conducive to climate change? Please share your thoughts.
Thank you. So I think there are many kind of factors that go into the extent to which the private sector involves itself in this process, and I think part of it is that the entire sector, and maybe rightfully so, is driven by profit or bottom line considerations, right? I think that it's probably not far from accurate to characterize your private sector firms as caring first and foremost about the bottom line, and that's determining their existence, their growth in the space, their ability to generate employment, etc. So I think there's nothing wrong with that. The question then is how do you link some of what we're seeing with respect to climate change and its impacts, particularly on vulnerable workers, to that kind of bottom line or profit consideration. So we've already discussed the idea of evidence generation. I think JPAL is obviously a leader in this space, and GBL tries to contribute in that regard as well. I think it's absolutely essential to bring the latest and best evidence to bear so that firms can make good decisions, because no firm in their right mind is going to decide to make large investments in any kind of technology that might have positive impacts on workers and be a mitigating factor with regard to impacts of climate change if they don't have good numbers on hand. That said, it's also the case, and I'm sure Starlene and Sai, you can speak from your perspectives on this front. It's extremely hard to get adoption, even if you have the right numbers and the exact experiment that you need, to sort of prove that something is profitable. As we see, throughout our daily lives, we don't do things that we know are good for us and optimal for us for a variety of different reasons. And that's just deciding sort of within ourselves, right? My dentist tells me that I should be flossing, every day, but I can't bring myself to do it more than a couple times a week. So, I think that there are, some cost and benefit considerations that people are making, but it's also much more complex when it comes to firms, deciding whether to make big decisions, especially related to, changing their infrastructure, their investments in technology, et cetera. I think that, chief amongst those considerations is, understanding the sort of decision making within firms and convincing not just the top, not your CEOs, but also layers down, managerial hierarchy, all the folks who are going to be affected by that decision, that this is a good idea. Because if you, I think, the benefits of the private sector are sometimes you just have to convince the CEO, and then, he sort of, or she sort of, sort of top down implements, a change. But the success of that implementation is really governed by all the layers below the CEO, all the people who are actually touching the technology and seeing its impact day to day. Those are the people who are going to determine the success of the change. And so, as part of that idea, it's important not only to convey information and convince folks who are at the top, but also, can make that change in belief happen for all levels of the hierarchy that are going to be, interested parties or stakeholders in this. And then the other, feature that's really important is understanding time horizons, because when you think about climate change, a lot of the problems that we see in terms of underinvestment and reluctance to change are because the time horizons of decision makers and their incentives are not aligned with the longer time horizons of climate change. So we're seeing this, when you think about the Paris Accords or at the country level, it happens all the time. Any given politician or leader in their limited time at the top finds it hard to implement change that's going to affect future generations in the time span of decades or hundreds of years. Part of that is kind of mitigated by the fact that we're seeing such unfortunately accelerated effects of climate change that we the extent to which we have extreme temperatures and extreme events, make it such that it's readily apparent to a lot of people already that this is happening and this is changing and we need to do something about it now. But it's still the case that the average CEO or leader in the private sector is going to care more about immediate profits and immediate survival rather than sort of the very long term. And so just basically understanding how to shift that decision making from the short to the long term is something that's really hard and difficult to do, but also extremely vital to getting any kind of change in the private sector. And I'll just say from GBL's perspective, in other areas where we've tried, to implement solutions in the private sector that improve well-being, things, for example, around worker voice, we've seen a ton of demand. Firms are very, very interested in picking these innovations up. But what they say is, look, I have no idea how to do this, and I don't have the time to figure it out. So if you've got something, nicely packaged and wrapped up in a bow tie for me, I would love to, implement it. But if I can't, rely on that implementation as essentially a service, we can't move forward. So I think as we're thinking about things like green technology adoption and that sort of thing, I think we also need to think about, green service adoption around that same idea that basically we can't expect firms to sort of change their infrastructure, change their technologies, and suddenly, snap to the frontier in terms of how to work and produce at efficient levels. As a result, we need to, also provide the kinds of wraparound service that's necessary, for decision makers and implementers who have very little time to make these changes. So, just want to emphasize that feature as salient as well. So, look forward to hearing, Sai and Starlene, your thoughts on this.
Thank you. And this tells us the challenges that lie ahead and that needs to be taken up by taking a future course of action. So back to Sai for the second round. And this is following is a question to you. JPAL has undertaken research on the impact of offering audits and consulting to firms on energy efficiency and carbon emissions. Do such audits and consulting have a positive impact on worker well-being? And does it help organizations design truly inclusive climate change solutions?
For sure. I think the short answer in terms of whether they have a positive impact on worker well-being is I don't know. I personally don't think that a lot of these programs are designed comprehensively enough to actually both meet climate goals as well as worker well-being goals. I do think, however, that I don't have a full answer for this. I do have an answer to this in terms of bits and pieces from different types of research that have been done. So I think first up on audits, and I think this extends Achyuta's point earlier, where a firm is not one entity. There are many layers within the firm that effectively come together to make decisions with, of course, the heads of organizations who have an outsized impact on the decision itself. I think beyond it itself, there's an ecosystem that exists along with firms that supports compliance with regulations, right? So for instance, auditors are part of that ecosystem. Now, auditors' incentive structures are in a sense entangled with the incentive structures of the firms themselves. So in one instance, this was sometime in the mid-90s, the Gujarat High Court effectively told a lot of firms and the Gujarat Pollution Control Board that the amount of pollution levels here are too high, something has to be done about it. And a program that they started testing out in the mid to late 90s was a third-party auditing system. Now, from the Pollution Control Board itself, the information coming out right at the beginning of this research project that I'm talking about is that the accuracy of these reports was fairly low. So if you see the plot, if suppose this is the amount of pollution limits, you would see that most firms report pollution levels right under that limit. And the Pollution Control Board, the regulators did not trust this data. So researchers were brought in to design a new auditing system. And the auditing system did effectively two things. One, instead of firms directly hiring auditors to come audit their plants, because there's a conflict of interest there, auditors were put together into a pool and auditors were randomly assigned to different plants. So that was one, to break the conflict of interest. The second piece, and the interesting thing that was coming out, is that auditors were not paid in full for the services they were providing. So they didn't have a monetary incentive to do their full job. So now in this new system, what they've done was effectively pool resources together from different firms. And so the actual cost of the audit was paid to the auditor through this model. So what ended up happening was, one, the Pollution Control Board started getting much more accurate reports. So while you would have almost normal distribution of pollution levels right below the level and just tapering off, you had the distribution was spread out a lot more. So you had many firms who were polluting much lesser than the actual limit, which was interesting. And they just didn't know that that they were actually below the limit. They were just paying the auditors to not produce accurate reports. The other thing is that there was some small number of firms that were like really like way off the charts in terms of how much pollution they were producing. So it's these firms that were extremely non-compliant, I would say, were the ones who the Pollution Control Board had the discretion to target these firms with the most severe penalties. So they are another stakeholder in this. So it's ultimately the government needs accurate data on what's happening to be able to even enforce the regulations it has on board now. Because I think some of the regulations, personally at least, are like really forward thinking, but the enforcement of them is like fairly like just not there in some instances. So I think governments need fairly accurate information to start addressing this problem. And I think back to something that Achyuta said, right? Achyuta said, right? It's private sector companies don't necessarily have the incentive to do anything about climate change. However, I think that there are multiple ways to kind of address or push private sector firms to be compliant with environmental needs. So one is, of course, regulations. There is something, and I would love to hear more from Ach on this, about how suppliers can or buyers can force or push their suppliers to be more compliant with one regulations, or in some instances even go over and above regulations. Because ultimately, if there is pressure on multinational companies to cut carbon emissions, these will be filtered through their entire supply chains, and the suppliers will need to be compliant with them. So whether we know the most cost-effective strategies that like buyers can use to do this, like I'm not fully sure. I don't think the evidence exists in that. But of course, I would love to hear from what Starlene and Ach have to say on this.
Thanks. Thank you, Sai, for those words. So I'll move to Starlene now. So since Green Earth are green financiers, could you please elaborate on what you look at while making an investment, and what does the current green startup landscape looks like in India currently? Thank you.
Thank you, Shraddha. So when we're looking at how to invest, we really look at, first and foremost, what can have an outsized climate impact, because reaching sort of the 1.5 or 2 degree goals and creating or supporting the innovations that are going to get us there, whether via business model, technology, or otherwise, is really our founding principle. So we first and foremost look at where can we see an outsized climate impact with economic viability. When we find organizations that we think have the ability to do this, then we look at where are within what they're doing, what are the types of support that they need that are beyond capital, because capital is a really significant issue. But in India, and this is getting a little bit into the second half of the question, in India, Startup India has approximately 2,500 startups that are listed in clean energy or green business. But when you look at these startups and where they're at on a technology readiness level, most of them are never getting beyond a technology readiness level of 4 or 5 on the scale that NASA developed, and that BIDRAC and a number of UNIDO and a number of other groups have adapted for climate. And so we see that there's a gap in the market there, where there's a need around support on commercialization and opportunities for businesses who have developed these types of technologies and these types of business models that could be really impactful, to have opportunities to demonstrate. And I think that this really sort of fits in with what Achyuta was saying, where, as we have looked at why companies aren't making it further, and startups and innovations, and even larger companies are not making it further along in their climate journey, it's really looking at why are we not adopting technologies that exist, that have in some cases existed for very long periods of time, and that can very clearly give an economic benefit. And very much like Achyuta was saying, it's not just about the cost benefit analysis. You're putting a technology within a large system and a complex system. And so it becomes not just, does this technology work, but how does it impact the rest of the technology? How does it impact the end product? how much downtime am I going to have to implement this technology? How often is it going to break? Are the parts going to be available? Is service going to be available? And that's just one level, right? The next level then, much like Achyuta was saying, is, and what about the employees, right? Because they're the ones that use it. So and with workers, there's often this notion that, these new technologies could disempower them or could reduce their job security. And so you find that there tends to be more hesitation. And so there really is this need to have the training, to have the empowerment, to discuss the issues around job security, and make sure that the workers are buying in and maybe understanding that, for example, a waste heat recycling system actually makes their work not only healthier and more enjoyable, but also they are now, able to do more and potentially have more economic upside, whether at the company or individual level. So there's more that goes into it than just finding, hey, here's an interesting technology. And so when we look at investments, we really look at that. And then an area that Green Artha, I think, is really putting a lot of effort and where we're spending a lot of time is how do we create the financial instruments that are needed? Because beyond the technology and beyond the workers, there's also this issue where companies that are working with very thin margins generally aren't ready to absorb the significant capital costs. And so how do you finance business models that can enable proven technologies to be adopted? And so there's models like the ESCO model, which EESL has made very viable in India, but where there's been a lot of difficulty adopting it across. There's a handful of startups that have started pay-as-you-save models, particularly around cooling, which are really, really exciting. There's leasing models, but all of these require access to finance that is typically really difficult to achieve. And so we very often look at, are there ways that we can use investment to prove financial models or business models that can help a technology be adopted? And that's where we really like to position ourselves as a firm. But yes, as to address that second part of the question, I think that there is this gap in the larger ecosystem around how do you move technologies from that technology readiness or business readiness level of 4 or 5 to full commercialization. And I think that I think that that's why discussions like this one are very important. How do we work with the corporate, the industrial, the small business sector to understand their needs, to allay their fears, to make it easier to adopt? And we'll see the same exact sorts of issues when we're looking at how do we do the same thing in agriculture. And are there ways that we can aggregate benefits and enable startups and or the end beneficiaries to participate in markets like the carbon markets, where there's actually an economic benefit for climate smart action? Are there ways that we can create financing mechanisms where it's actually an economic benefit for a small business to adopt climate friendly technologies? And I think that, especially when we look at some of the pledges that are coming out of the net zero asset managers and whatnot, if we really hold their feet to the fire and make them live up to the commitments that they're making, there should be financing available for a lot of these different pieces. But very much like Sai was saying, it's much better if we can prove the models and give it to people in sort of a cookie cutter, cut and paste format, because when you're running a small business, it's just much too difficult to also try to do all of these other pieces, and especially when there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that that's one of the things that's exciting about working in the investment space is our job is really to understand and price risk and look at how do we reduce risk. But we need to take a much more, from the financial sector, we need to take a much more inclusive and expansive view of what that means, especially on the innovation side.
Thank you so much. So this takes me to the later part of our discussion. So Now we have some common questions for our panelists, so we want them to respond to them, and also please take this opportunity to have more conversation with each other, respond to each other, and ask questions to each other too. So the first question for all of you is as follows: how does social science research fit into with climate action policy? So how do you see these two coming together? And how do we balance social responsibility across suppliers, buyers, workers in the whole supply ecosystem? Also take this opportunity to reflect from your own work and and tell us what would be the priority areas going ahead. Thank you. Starting in the same order, Achyuta, Sai, and then Starlene. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess on the first question, I mean, I think we've highlighted a bit of, the role that social science research can play. I think more broadly than just the private sector or just workers. Obviously, there are, incredible, kind of structural features of the economy that are changing, both in terms of the ability for certain sectors to produce efficiently, as well as the sort of spatial concentration of the economy and what that means for workers and migration. Are all incredibly important features of climate change that affect the economy and are the subject of social science research more broadly. So I think, moving forward, I think there's a clear, mandate for understanding one, sort of what happens in response to climate change across across the entire economy. So one key area that I'm interested in, that there's lots of folks doing work on, is how extreme heat changes patterns of migration, and how coastal erosion changes patterns of migration, and how that might affect the hubs of economic activity. So while you might have say a huge sort of hub of economic activity in Bangkok, as oceans rise and the city becomes hotter and hotter, maybe folks will move inland or move to different cities or second and third tier cities, and then that's going to have huge implications for the development of those cities, for the kinds of services that need to be provided, for the location of firms and of economic activity more generally. So that's just a really interesting part of economic research that I think is relevant for climate change. The other, I think, mandate is what we talked about regarding understanding decision making, because I think the one thing that economics does best is sort of understand how individuals and groups of individuals or organizations make decisions. So thinking about the non-adoption of certain mitigative technologies or practices, and what levers we might pull, whether it's regulation or incentives or involving the supply chain or what have you. I think all of those are the purview of economics, and would be profitable areas of research in thinking about how might we actually convince firms. I've seen very little in terms of experimentation to that regard, and I think that'd be really useful to say, armed with the right evidence, what is it about firm decision making where you can actually get a certain substantial number of firms to adopt something, and can we prove that using rigorous economic evaluations. And then finally, I guess I'd say, this is work that is naturally lends itself to collaboration across disciplines. And so, as much as economists, hate to do that, I think it's totally necessary in this regard that, pairing up with climate scientists, with folks who are in the health space, who are understanding, physiological impacts, with folks in the sort of, industrial engineering space to understand technology adoption and what sorts of technologies might be useful. All of that, I think, is super, necessary. So, hopefully we should see more cross-disciplinary collaborations to get, to expand the frontier of knowledge.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks for that set of questions. So I think the points that Arch raised are very important, of course. As climate change is here, it is happening, sea levels are going to rise. The choice to some extent that we have is to what extent that is going to happen for us. So I think an important area of future research for us is how do our existing systems, particularly the agriculture system, adapt to climate change. So I think in this, how can we manage resources more sustainably? How do we help our ecosystems, or how do our agricultural and economic activity fit in well with the natural ecosystems that we have around us? I think that is an important area of future research. And of course, dealing with this, something that else that comes up is how do we build up the resilience of communities from the bottom up? I think a lot of conversation is happening about national programs, even to large extents like state level programs. I think one area of research is how can we empower communities themselves with one information to start acting on their own resilience. And second is providing them with financial resources and the specific types of financial resources and support they need from governments or even private sector organizations to make adaptation possible. I think the second big piece of this is, as I've said, collaborating with different stakeholders. I think one of the most important systems we have in place that kind of our climate action relies on, or even in some instances is the cause of many of our climate change problems, is the electricity grid. It is perhaps the largest machines that humans build. They span just like across states and countries sometimes. And a lot of technical expertise is needed there from various fields to make the system operate. And I think it's important to create platforms where all these stakeholders can come together and work on ideas together, so that ultimately whatever does come out from them is everyone's input is there right from the beginning, as opposed to working in silos and then trying to figure out like which is the best solution that comes up from these silos. I think that is fairly time consuming. And a key part of making this happen is really working with administrative and remote sensing data. I think if you look at, for instance, government systems, many departments, many ministries have information in silos. And it's really information across these systems that kind of speaks to the challenges that we face with climate change. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to build up these data collection systems so that it's easily accessible to both people working within governments as well as researchers and technical experts. So I think that's an area of work that needs to happen to build this foundational layer so that the next level of research can happen. I think that's something important. And I think something that I do want to stress is that if you look at historical data, there is no country where that has developed without a minimum access to energy. I think while we continue to tackle climate change, it's important to remember that the most vulnerable populations are the ones who don't have access to energy. And without access to energy, you don't have systems of cooling in place, like you don't have fans that you can have at home. So I think energy access should continue to be an important plank of future research, so that either whether it's working with national grids, whether it's working with distributed energy providers to support to continue the spread of energy access that we've seen in India over the last, 10, 15 years, we've made tremendous progress. So I think like that needs to be like taken to the last mile. I'm going to pause with this and hand it to Starlene.
Thank you so much, Sai, for those thoughts. Yes, please, Starlene, please share your comments on points that we have been discussing.
Yes, thank you. So from my perspective, climate and the economy really are both in some ways very parallel, right? Every place that the economy touches, climate also touches, and climate perhaps touches beyond that. So from our perspective, there's really an importance in understanding how is it that when we look at the tools that are used, that are and have been used to build the existing economy, how do we make those available in a responsible way for climate, right? There's a lack of both capital for climate right now, as well as financing tools, right? Like in India, we see there's debt, like pretty plain vanilla debt, hard to access, banks want collateral and all of these other things, that would be required of a mainstream business. There's equity, and there's a little bit that's happening around blended finance, and then there's grants, but these aren't really, and then we have some project finance that's happening at the infrastructure level when we're looking at mainstream large scale infrastructure projects like solar grids and so forth. But we really need to look at how can we make the financial side of the climate economy or the green economy available so that the rest of the economy can grow. And how do we create those tools and test those tools and validate those tools so we know which tools to use where. So that's an area I would love to see more research. Very much like Achyuta said, we also need to be looking at, on the economic side, which are the levers that enable decision making, which are the levers that prevent the types of decision making we would like to see. So those would be areas that we both do work, and we're at Green Artha, we're definitely not at all scientific in terms of like publishing research or, but those are the areas that we see that there, is a lot of need for work. And that's not to take away at all from the other areas that Achyuta and Sai mentioned. We think that there's really a need for data collaboration. One additional area that we don't do work, but that we would love to see more both collaboration and perhaps some research is how do you take terminology from the climate space and make that accessible? We see that there's terms that are used in climate science that are used very differently by mainstream society, and that can create a lot of confusion from time to time. And so how do we create that vernacular or language that is common across researchers, that's common across financiers, that's common across policy, and that's common across the types of entities that are really trying to be progressive. And that's an area we would love to see work being done. We have recently, we're about to publish a report on the climate innovation ecosystem, and that is also something that was highlighted both by entrepreneurs as well as policymakers and investors in India. In terms of collaboration, data is hugely important. There are sources of data. Argyum, which is a foundation that works on water, or not Argyum, Atri, which is a foundation that works around water, is doing fantastic work around how do you collect localized data. So not government data, but these small communities have so much information in terms of what is the water level and where are the wells, where is water in their community, and they're aggregating that data so that we can have a much better understanding of water tables. So, I think there's, the data needs to go, top down and bottoms up, and there's collaboration, I think, is hugely important. It's not one silo, it's not just business, it's not just agriculture, it's not just transport that got us into this mess. And so there really has to be collaboration across board to get us out of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we had some very exciting and important discussion today. I'll just put 2-3 points that I found key across our conversation. One is the importance of intent across sectors and for all stakeholders, evidence creation, preparedness. There has to be a lot of dialogue across sector about preparedness. And one important theme that emerged across discussions is the interdisciplinary discussion and sharing of information using different kinds of technologies and data collection tools like remote sensing and financial discussion of financial tools. It has been a fascinating discussion, and we have to have more collaborative discussions like we are having one, and that will be very important to go ahead. So now it's time to take some questions from our audience. We have some important questions put up in the Q&A section. I will read the one, first I'll read the ones which are to a specific panelist, then we'll go on to the ones which are not to anyone in specific, but general comments or questions. So here's the first question for Achyuta. Could you please help us understand economic effects of not addressing worker well-being that is conducive to climate change at the macro country level? And then there is a question for Starlene. What are some climate innovation strategies that you could suggest that firm could undertake for ensuring their workers' well-being? Please have your responses to it. First, Achyuta, then Starlene.
Yeah, so this is that good question, but not my area of expertise really. But I think some of the best work in that regard, there's some nice kind of like micro type evidence on this by Melissa Dell, Ben Jones, and Ben Elkin. They have a couple papers and maybe a review article as well on the kind of sort of macroeconomy effects of rising temperatures, and presumably the idea is that if we can extrapolate to how large impacts we should see, say using climate projections that go out 50 years and say if we do nothing, how much will temperatures rise and how much of a impact on the economy will that generate, and those papers, I can't remember the exact effect sizes they find, but they were pretty substantial in terms of the impacts found, and they do this kind of for all countries across the world, as well as then splitting it across sort of several dimensions of heterogeneity that are important. And I think the key takeaway there is, of course, that since most of the low-income countries of the world tend to be the ones that will see the largest increases in temperatures, we're going to see, and they tend to be the ones that are hottest at baseline, we're going to see the largest impacts there. I also think there's quite a lot of interesting impacts that work finds on things that are beyond your basic sort of agriculture impacts that would be expected, but even things like the services economy, the innovation economy, the knowledge economy, those things are affected by temperature as well, which are maybe a little bit less obvious, but of course incredibly important and growing contributors to the overall economy of low-income places. So I think I would reference that work. Again, it's Melissa Dell, Ben Jones, and Ben Elkin have done those papers. Yeah, good stuff.
Thank you, Achyuta, for responding to the important question. Starlene?
Yeah, so when we look at which types of climate innovation strategies or technologies might be relevant to a firm, a lot of times that's going to be dependent on the type of firm. But across the board, I think that there's a lot of energy efficiency technologies that can have a really significant impact on worker well-being. And that can be anything from like a waste heat recycling system, which essentially just takes heat out of the system, which makes it uncomfortable for workers and turns that into energy or heat that is used in another functionality. But we see it across the board. There's technologies within a specific system that can be implemented that are far more energy efficient, but also very often, because they're more advanced technologies, reduce the amount of labor or how hard the labor that the user of that particular function is. So it really depends. Like within building and construction, when we look at a lot of the green technologies that are coming up, they very often make it so that the work of a construction worker is actually safer and more pleasant, right? And that's going to be important as we move into years that are hotter and hotter. So many of the construction labor are outside and working through the heat of the day. But because of the way these technologies are designed, there are systems and processes where they have to be used in a certain way. So there's worker safety training that gets built into it. And so these different pieces really have ways of influencing the outcomes for workers in a way that can be very positive. And to a degree, I mean, there are technologies that could displace workers, but there's, and as much as there are technologies that might displace workers, I think when we look at the larger green economy, there's so many areas where it's also expected to create new jobs. And so it's really at that point, I think, an issue of, finding the balance and making sure that there are resources within the larger economy to help retrain or train workers for the new types of jobs that are coming up. And for the person who asked this question, I'm happy to share my email. If you have specifics about your business or a particular industry, I'd be happy to share any insights that I might have.
Thank you, Starlene, for that conversation, and that's very helpful for all of us. So we have two more questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box, but they are not specified. So please feel free to respond. Anybody feel free to respond to that. So there's a question that, is there a fear of this whole concept becoming a fad and initiative in this space becoming equivalent to greenwashing, or the person who has asked this question also calls it pink washing? So your responses to that. The second question we have about RCTs, that many social science researchers have raised objections on RCTs. So would one say that this type of research, that is the best methodology? What else more could be done? I think Sai can take care of this question and help us understand this more. Thank you.
Thank you, Shraddha. And I think first up, there's someone, one of my colleagues is in the audience, Molshri. She's from the training vertical. She can give a very more in-depth, like a much better technical response to this. I think my response is that RCT is one tool, a powerful tool that researchers have within their toolbox, and it should be used appropriately for it. For different circumstances. I think that even when researchers conduct RCTs or any other type of research, it's the quality of that research that matters into giving you good outputs. I think that a lot of the objections that people raise against RCTs are objections that you can raise against like just bad research. I think that's something to be there. I think there are some fair objections out there. It is an expensive process to run. RCTs do take time to get completed. And I think, which is why it's very important for researchers to work along with implementing organizations or their collaborators to make sure that they design a research that's really useful to them and not just useful to researchers for the sake of publishing. I think those are my two broad responses. And I think even within RCTs, just researchers don't do just RCTs. I think JPAL South Asia and JPAL in general are competitive advantages doing RCTs. I think the researchers like Achyuta they don't restrict themselves to doing just RCTs. It's just that they sometimes might collaborate with JPAL for the sake of the RCTs. So I think there are a lot of other methodologies that kind of work, can be used in conjunction with RCTs to just enrich the research, entire research process. So I think there's a very nice blog actually that the JPAL North America office put out about how qualitative research really can be done alongside RCTs to improve the quality of research. I'm going to pause here with this question. And I think the other question that you had is about, is this just becoming a fad? I'm going to just like two-line response. I think it's hard to ignore if Mumbai, or at least large parts of Mumbai, are like underwater for 2-3 months in a year, especially when there's so many people who already understand some of the causes behind it. So I think in the past, there might have been a risk of this becoming a fad. There is still a risk of this becoming a fad in many instances, like many companies, for instance, just greenwashing their programs. I do feel, and I hope that there is enough momentum from people who actually care about it to, you know, like point out and actually investigate whether what many companies, governments, etc. claim actually hold out on the ground. And I think, I hope there's enough momentum to, you know, unpack the greenwashing concerns that many people have.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to say anything on the questions? On both the questions, both the open-ended questions?
On the topic
Achyuta,
of, yes, on the topic of greenwashing, I would say in many ways I agree with Sai. I think that there have been years of greenwashing. You know, the climate has been a topic that has come up off and on really since like the 50s or 60s. It has had periods of being popular and then periods of being ignored. But I would say really across the board, we've reached a point where, you know, anywhere you look, we're seeing the impacts of climate change. And when you look at things like the World Economic Forum for the last several years in a row, climate has been consistently in the top 5 of risk. Most years it has been the #1 in risk, with COVID, of course, like having an impact on that. But I think that because of that, while sometimes like the implementation or action might be slower than we would like, I think that there is a lot of momentum behind trying to figure out how to solve the problem. And really, you know, I think that there's a lot of intent around how to solve the problem by certain parts of you know, the larger green community, if you will. I do think that there are a lot of organizations that sort of chase money, and they see that climate and environment are popular now. And so they try to build a thesis around this or try to apply climate. You know, I sometimes call it putting a green bow around whatever they're otherwise doing. You know, and I think that organizations that are more active in climate, you know, we have a responsibility to either hold hands or reject those types of initiatives, right? And I see that as being, you know, if we're going to hold their hand, like, let's help them see how there can be a benefit in actually being green. And if we don't see that that can happen, you know, then we have a responsibility to make sure that that is not an initiative that is promoted or well-resourced, because, you know, very much like we've seen with even, you know, social innovations and climate innovations, when you put them into a market and they're destined to fail, it can spoil a market. And so those of us who are here in good faith and have access and networks do have a responsibility for making sure that, you know, people who have good intent are given what they need to try to do better if they don't know or have, and to, you know, also be gatekeepers.
thank you. Achyuta, do you want to say something on this?
So yeah, I mean, I guess regarding the RCT point, I generally concur with what Sai said, and I tend to use RCTs when we're thinking about impact evaluation, but in certain instances, it just makes more sense to do something else, or RCTs are just sort of infeasible. And in those cases, I think there's a whole spectrum of potentially viable empirical strategies that one can use. But I think to this greenwashing idea, I think that it is true, in my experiences with the private sector, thinking about buyers and their incentives, that there is this tendency to take the most visible and least costly sort of option from the menu of things that you can do, and that's often not the most impactful and worthwhile thing to choose, or the thing that's going to sort of cause the most mitigation, etc. So from my perspective, I think greenwashing is definitely real, and is baked into the incentive system. So I think to the extent that you can avoid it, and you can kind of change that kind of cost benefit ratio, whether it's through incentivizing the stuff that actually works, or changing people's beliefs around it, or increasing consumer awareness, those things would be beneficial. But it's something that, at least in the private sector, that needs to be dealt with pretty regularly.
Thank you so much. And we have had a very great conversations, important ones, scintillating ones, and then also mind-boggling to think a lot of things have to be done in future, and we need to build more collaborations like the one we are having right now. I take this opportunity from behalf of Rethinking Economics India Network, GBL, to thank our speakers, all the participants. And I request all of you to join us for our next session under this theme, Big Money, Markets and Climate Change, at 8 p.m. The link is provided in the chat box. Do join us, and thank you once again for having time to speak with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And do share your feedback on our sessions. The link is in the chat box. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.